Ethan looked at the empty velvet hollow in his top dresser drawer. It was a small, dark blue box, hinged with delicate brass. For 2 years, it had held the sum of his mother's legacy, compressed into a single, perfect object. Now, the indentation where the ring had rested looked like a wound. He closed the drawer, the soft click of the wood echoing the sudden silence in his chest. He didn't need to search the apartment. He didn't need to tear through closets or upend cushions. He knew, with a certainty that was as cold and hard as a diamond, that it was gone, and he knew who had taken it. He walked into the living room. Clara was on the sofa, bathed in the cool blue light of her phone, one lacquered nail scrolling endlessly through a feed of curated perfection. She was beautiful, sculpted by effort and ambition. Her blonde hair was a masterpiece of casual elegance. Her clothes were a testament to her discerning taste, a taste she often reminded him he lacked. She looked up, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. It was a smile designed for public consumption, and he, it seemed, had become her permanent public. "What's wrong, darling?" she asked, her voice a smooth, practiced melody. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Ethan stood before her, his hands loose at his sides. He felt a strange calm settle over him, the kind of stillness that precedes a storm. "The ring is gone, right?" he said. The statement was simple, devoid of accusation, a fact presented for inspection. Clara's face flickered through a series of micro-expressions, a flash of irritation, a shadow of guilt before settling on a mask of theatrical concern. She placed a hand over her heart. "Oh, Ethan, no. Are you sure? Where did you last see it?" "I last saw it where it always is," he replied, his voice even. "In its box, in my drawer." She stood up, gliding towards him. She took his hands in hers. They were cool to the touch. "We'll find it," she cooed. "It must have just been misplaced. You know how things can get lost in this tiny apartment." It was a familiar jab, a casual reminder of his perceived station, of the life she felt they were living, which was so far beneath the one she deserved. Ethan didn't pull his hands away. He simply let them rest in her grasp, feeling the disconnect between her words of comfort and the cold truth radiating from her. "I don't think it was misplaced, Clara." She finally met his gaze, and for a second her composure wavered. A hint of defiance hardened her features. She sighed, a long dramatic exhalation of performative patience. "All right," she said, dropping his hands and turning away, walking towards the window that overlooked the modest city street. "There's no point in hiding it, I suppose. I was going to tell you." Ethan waited. The silence stretched, filled only by the distant hum of traffic. "I gave it away," she said, her back still to him. She made it sound like an act of charity, a noble sacrifice. The words landed, but they didn't shatter him. Instead, they crystallized something that had been forming within him for months, a hard, clear understanding of the woman he had asked to be his wife. He thought of the ring, not of its monetary value, which was considerable, but of his mother's hand wearing it. He remembered her twisting it on her finger as she read to him, the way the simple gold band and its single understated diamond caught the light. It wasn't a showpiece. It was a symbol of a love that was quiet, enduring, and real. Everything Clara was not. "You gave it away," he repeated. It wasn't a question. She turned around, her expression now one of exasperation, as if he were a difficult child. "Yes, to my cousin Amelia. It was her engagement party last weekend, you remember? I couldn't show up with some cheap trinket. It would have been embarrassing for both of us. So you gave her my mother's ring." "Honestly, Ethan, it was an old-fashioned thing," she said, waving a dismissive hand. "It was sweet that your mother left it to you. It truly was. But it's not me. We need to think about our future, about getting a proper ring, something that reflects where we're going, not where you've been." She smiled, a dazzling, confident smile that expected agreement, that demanded it. She thought the conversation was over. She thought this was a minor hurdle, a small act of domestic diplomacy she had navigated successfully. She didn't know that this conversation was, in fact, the beginning of the end. She didn't know that the tiny apartment was one of 17 properties he owned in the city. She didn't know that his simple job as a junior architect was a self-imposed apprenticeship before taking over his family's multi-billion-dollar construction and development firm. She didn't know that the man standing before her, the man she saw as a project to be molded and upgraded, was the one person she could not afford to underestimate. Within 1 week, her entire world, built on a foundation of blissful, arrogant ignorance, would be reduced to rubble. But before we watch that foundation crack, I want to ask you something. Have you ever felt underestimated? Pushed aside? We love stories about the quiet ones finally finding their voice. And if you do too, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what happens next. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from today? It's amazing to see how far these stories travel. Now, let's get back to Ethan and the storm he was about to unleash. Their story had begun, as so many do, with a carefully constructed illusion. Not Ethan's, but Clara's. They met at a gallery opening, a world of sharp angles and even sharper people. Ethan was there not for the art, but for the architecture of the building itself, a new renovation project his firm was scouting. He was dressed in his usual manner, a well-made but unremarkable gray suit, a simple watch, his focus entirely on the structural details of the vaulted ceiling. He was observing the load-bearing columns when a voice, like chilled champagne, cut through the ambient chatter. Assessing the competition, he turned to see Clara. She was a vision in a crimson dress, holding a flute of champagne as if it were a scepter. She had mistaken him for a rival architect, a peer. In that first moment, under the assumption of professional equality, she was charming, witty, and engaging. They talked for an hour about design philosophy, about the tension between form and function. Ethan, who had spent years studying under the world's best, spoke with a quiet authority she found captivating. It was only when she asked which firm he was with that the first subtle shift occurred. "I'm with Sterling Cole," he'd said, naming the small, respectable boutique firm he'd chosen for his apprenticeship. Her smile tightened by a millimeter, imperceptible to most, but not to Ethan. "Oh," she said, her tone shifting from engagement to assessment. "Sterling Cole. They do good work. Very solid." The word hung in the air, weighted with condescension. Solid was a word you used for station wagons and sensible shoes, not for a man she had, moments before, found intriguing. In that instant, he was no longer a peer. He was a project. Their courtship was a study in her attempts to refine him. She introduced him to her mother, Eleanor, a woman who was a paler, more brittle version of her daughter. They had lunch at a restaurant where the water cost more than Ethan's typical lunch. Eleanor had surveyed him with the shrewd eye of a jeweler inspecting a questionable stone. "Clara tells me you're an architect, Ethan," Eleanor had said, her voice dripping with manufactured sweetness. "Such a creative field, though I imagine it's quite difficult to make a real name for oneself without the right connections." "I enjoy the work," Ethan had replied calmly, taking a sip of his overpriced water. "I believe good work eventually speaks for itself." Eleanor had shared a look with Clara, a silent exchange that spoke volumes. It said, "He's naive, but perhaps trainable." The humiliations were rarely overt. They were 1,000 tiny cuts. There were comments about his 10-year-old sedan. "It's very reliable, I'm sure," Clara would say, "but it doesn't exactly scream up and coming, does it?" There were the suggestions for his wardrobe, which involved her leaving shopping bags from expensive designers on his bed, the implicit message being that his own choices were inadequate. When he took her to his favorite restaurant, a small, family-owned Italian place with checkered tablecloths and phenomenal pasta she'd picked at her food and said, "It's charmingly rustic, darling, for a change." He endured it all with a patience that Clara and her mother mistook for meekness. They saw a handsome, intelligent man of modest means, a good raw material from which to sculpt a suitable husband. They believed his quiet nature was a sign of a lack of ambition, a placid contentment with his lot in life that she, Clara, would graciously cure him of. He was her fixer-upper. The proposal was her idea, though she'd orchestrated it so that he believed it was his. After a year of dating, she began talking about their future, about timelines, about the biological clock. It was all done with a light touch, but the pressure was constant. Ethan, wanting to see this experiment through to its conclusion, decided to play his part. He knew the one thing he possessed that was worthy of this moment was his mother's ring. The night he showed it to her, before the proposal, he tried to explain its significance. They were in his apartment, the one she so frequently disparaged. He sat on the edge of the sofa and opened the small velvet box. "My mother designed this with my father," he said softly, his voice thick with a rare display of emotion. "She was a jewelry designer before she got sick. Not famous, but brilliant. She believed elegance was about simplicity, not size. The diamond is flawless, but she deliberately chose a smaller stone. She said it represented a concentrated, perfect love, not a loud one." Clara had looked at the ring. Her face was a careful blank, but he could see the flicker of disappointment in her eyes. It was a beautiful ring, objectively. A delicate, hand-twisted band of pale gold, with a single brilliant cut diamond held in a setting that looked like an opening flower. It was timeless, elegant, and worth more than the new car Clara was currently leasing. But to her, it was small. It was understated. It wouldn't make her friends gasp with envy. "It's lovely, Ethan," she'd said, the word lovely carrying the same damning weight as solid and charming. She touched it with the tip of her finger, but didn't pick it up. "It means so much that you'd share this with me." A week later, he proposed. He did it in a way he knew she'd appreciate, at a scenic viewpoint overlooking the city at sunset. He got down on one knee, said the words he was supposed to say, and held out the box. She'd said yes, of course. She'd slid the ring onto her finger, held it up to the dying light, and performed the perfect picture of joy. But as she hugged him, she'd whispered in his ear, "It's beautiful for now, darling. A placeholder for our future." He had held her, the scent of her expensive perfume filling his senses, and felt nothing but a profound sense of loss. Not for her, but for the ring. He had given a piece of his mother's soul to a woman who saw it as a temporary accessory, and in that moment, he knew their own future was just as temporary. He simply had to decide when and how it would end. The weeks following the engagement were an escalation. Clara wore the ring, but she wore it like a burden. At parties, when her friends would grab her hand to admire it, she would offer a self-deprecating little laugh. "Oh, it's just a family piece," she'd say, the just twisting the knife a little deeper. "Ethan is so sentimental." The subtext was clear. This isn't what I chose. This is not a reflection of my worth. The primary battleground became Ethan's apartment. To him, it was a sanctuary. It was the first place he had lived on his own, a space he had curated with things that held meaning. Books passed down from his grandfather, a worn leather armchair that had been his father's, a single powerful abstract painting his mother had bought from a struggling artist decades ago. To Clara, it was a glorified dorm room. "We simply cannot build a life here, Ethan," she declared one evening, standing in the middle of his living room, with her hands on her hips as if surveying a disaster site. "We need to sell this place, and your stocks, or whatever little investments you have, we'll pool our resources and get a mortgage on a proper home. I saw a divine new condo development over in the Westlake district." Ethan was sitting in his father's armchair, a leather-bound journal resting in his lap. It was his mother's, filled with her sketches, her thoughts on design, her musings on life. He often held it when Clara launched into one of her tirades, its worn cover a tangible link to a world of substance and integrity. He ran a thumb over the faded gold lettering of her initials. "My resources are not little, Clara," he said, his voice quiet but firm, "and I'm not selling this apartment." She stared at him, genuinely baffled. It was one of the first times he had presented a solid wall to her ambitions. "Don't be silly. Of course you are. This place might fetch enough for a down payment, if we're lucky. We have to be strategic. My salary alone won't get us the kind of mortgage we need for a place that isn't a social death sentence." He looked at her, truly looked at her. He saw the panic in her eyes, the desperate, clawing need to not just keep up with her social circle, but to dominate it. Her identity was entirely external, built from the opinions of others and the logos on her possessions. "I'm not selling," he repeated. "This apartment isn't an investment. It's my home." Her face hardened. "It's a starter home, Ethan. The point of a starter home is to start and then move on. Are you telling me you have no ambition?" Is this it? Is this the life you imagine for us? For me? The question was an indictment. He was, in her eyes, a dead end. A man content with his small life, who was now threatening to anchor her to his own mediocrity. He could have ended it then. He could have opened the journal, shown her the sketches for jewelry pieces that were now in museum collections. He could have picked up his phone and made a call that would have revealed his entire hidden world. But the timing wasn't right. The lesson had not yet been fully formed. She needed to see the culmination of her own choices, the final logical endpoint of her philosophy. Instead, he closed the journal and placed it on the table beside him. We can talk about our living situation later, Clara. It's not an urgent matter. Her frustration was palpable. Not urgent, she scoffed. My entire future is not urgent. It was a telling slip. My future, not our future. In the days that followed, Ethan began his own quiet preparations. He made a call to a man named Arthur Davies, an old trusted friend of his father's and the family's senior legal counsel. The call was brief and to the point. Arthur, it's Ethan. Ethan, good to hear your voice. How is the view from the ground floor? It was their old joke about Ethan's apprenticeship. The view is becoming problematic, Ethan said. I need you to start drawing up the paperwork. The transition. I think the experiment is nearing its conclusion. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Is everything all right, son? Arthur's voice was filled with genuine concern. Everything is becoming clear, Ethan replied. He looked around his apartment at the things he cherished. I'm liquidating the test account, and I need you to execute the purchase of the Westlake property, the penthouse suite, in my name only. Consider it done, Arthur said, the understanding dawning in his voice. I assume your fiancée is unaware of this? She is unaware of a great many things, Ethan said, his eyes landing on the empty space on Clara's finger where the ring should have been. She had taken it off and left it on her nightstand, claiming it was too delicate for everyday wear. I believe she's about to provide the final piece of data I require. He hung up the phone and felt a profound sense of melancholy. He had genuinely hoped in the beginning that Clara might see past the surface, that she might discover the man and not the balance sheet he was hiding. But she had failed every single test. She had looked at a priceless painting and seen only a splash of color that didn't match her imagined decor. She had sat in a chair that had held his father for 30 years and complained that the leather was worn, and she had held his mother's heart in her hand and declared it a placeholder. The lesson would have to be a harsh one, not for his sake, but for hers. It was the only way she might ever learn to see the world and the people in it for what they truly were. The lie, when it came, was almost insultingly clumsy. Clara had been distant for 2 days, a cloud of manufactured anxiety following her around the apartment. She would sigh dramatically while staring out the window, or clutch her forehead as if plagued by a terrible migraine. It was a prelude, a poorly rehearsed one-act play leading up to the main performance. The performance began on a Tuesday evening. Ethan was in the kitchen, making dinner. He found a quiet pleasure in cooking, in the methodical process of transforming simple ingredients into something whole and nourishing. The aroma of garlic and basil filled the small space. Clara drifted in, wrapped in a silk robe, her face a mask of tragedy. Ethan, she began, her voice trembling slightly, something terrible has happened. He turned from the stove, his expression calm. What is it, Clara? The ring, she whispered, bringing a hand to her lips. Your mother's ring. It's gone. I think I lost it. She finally managed to produce a tear, which tracked a clean line through her foundation. I've looked everywhere. I retraced my steps. I went back to the cafe, the gym. It's just gone. Ethan watched her. He felt a detached sort of fascination. He had expected a better lie, a more intricate story. This was lazy. It was the kind of lie you tell when you have so little respect for the person you're lying to, that you don't even feel the need to make it convincing. You simply expect them to accept it because their opinion is of no consequence. You lost it, he said, his voice flat. I'm so sorry, she sobbed, rushing forward to bury her face in his chest. I feel absolutely awful. I know how much it meant to you. Please forgive me. We can go to the jeweler tomorrow. We can pick out something new. Something even more beautiful. My treat. The offer was the final, perfect insult. She would replace his mother's legacy with her own money, erasing the sentimental value she despised, and replacing it with the transactional value she worshipped. He put his hands on her shoulders, gently but firmly pushing her back so he could see her face. Her eyes were red-rimmed, but he could see the calculation behind the tears. She was watching him, gauging his reaction, ready to adjust her performance accordingly. "There's no need to go to a jeweler, Clara," he said softly. A wave of relief washed over her face. She thought he was letting her off the hook, that his sentimentality was as shallow as she'd always suspected. "Oh, Ethan, thank you. I knew you'd understand." "I do understand," he said. "I understand completely." He let the moment hang in the air, then turned back to the stove and turned off the flame under the sauce. The scent of basil seemed suddenly sharper, more intense. The quiet before the storm. He knew he could confront her now, but the stage wasn't set. A revelation of this magnitude required the right setting, the right audience. It needed to be a moment she would never forget. The final piece of evidence he needed arrived the next day, not through a confession, but through the digital window of social media. He was at his desk at Sterling Cole, reviewing blueprints for a small community library, when a notification popped up. A friend of a friend had tagged Clara in a photo. He clicked on it. The photo was from Amelia's engagement party the previous weekend. A group of young, bright, wealthy people clinking champagne glasses. In the center of the photo was Amelia, Clara's cousin, her hand held up to the camera to showcase her own large, modern engagement ring, and on the fourth finger of her other hand, unmistakable and profoundly out of place, was his mother's ring, the delicate, twisted gold band, the single perfect diamond in its floral setting. He zoomed in. It was undeniably it. He felt a cold fury, so pure and so deep, it was almost peaceful. It wasn't the hot rage of betrayal, but the icy certainty of a verdict delivered. Then he read the caption Amelia had written, "Celebrating with my amazing fiancé, and a huge thank you to my incredible cousin, Clara, for this absolutely stunning vintage ring. It's the most thoughtful, something old a girl could ask for. You have the best taste." The best taste. Clara had taken his mother's soul and used it as a social token, a bauble to curry favor and display her supposed generosity and style. She hadn't even had the decency to ask Amelia to keep it quiet. Her arrogance was so complete, her belief in his blindness so absolute, that she didn't even consider the possibility of being caught. Ethan leaned back in his chair, the blueprints for the library forgotten on his screen. He looked out the window at the city skyline, a jagged line of steel and glass against the gray sky. For months, he had been an observer in his own life, collecting data, watching the drama unfold with a clinical detachment. But the time for observation was over. The experiment was complete, the hypothesis proven beyond any doubt. The time for action had arrived. He picked up his phone, his movements deliberate and precise. He didn't call Clara. He didn't call Amelia. He sent a single text message. "Dinner tomorrow night, 8 o'clock, Le Ciel, just the three of us." He sent it to Clara and then forwarded the exact same message to her mother, Eleanor. Le Ciel was the most exclusive, most expensive restaurant in the city, a place with a 6-month waiting list and a view from the top of the tallest skyscraper, a place so far beyond the means of a junior architect that the invitation itself was a statement. Clara would see it as a surrender, a lavish apology for her loss. She would think he was finally ready to play the game by her rules. She would be wrong. It wasn't an apology. It was a summons. The text message landed in Clara's world like a winning lottery ticket. She saw the name of the restaurant, Le Ciel, and a triumphant smile spread across her face. It had worked. Her performance of distress, her carefully deployed tears, had not only absolved her of losing the ring, but had shocked Ethan into action. He was finally understanding what it took to keep a woman like her. He was stepping up. She immediately called her mother. "He's taking us to Le Ciel," she said, her voice giddy. "Tomorrow night." "Le Ciel?" Eleanor's voice was a mixture of surprise and approval. "Well, well, it seems our Ethan is learning. Perhaps he has more ambition than we thought. Or maybe just a credit card with a dangerously high limit. They both laughed. A sharp, conspiratorial sound. He feels guilty about the ring, obviously, Clara said, preening as she examined her nails. This is his way of making it up to me. We're turning a corner, Mother. I can feel it. First this dinner, then the new ring, then he'll finally see sense about that dreadful apartment. For Ethan, the next 24 hours were a study in controlled calm. He finished his work at Sterling Coal, bidding a quiet farewell to colleagues who had no idea they would soon be reading his name in the business section. He went home to the apartment Clara so despised and packed a single small suitcase. He placed his mother's leather-bound journal on top. Then he made one final call to Arthur Davies. Everything is in place, Arthur, Ethan said. The penthouse at Westlake is registered in your name as of an hour ago, Arthur confirmed. The keys are with the concierge, and the board has been notified. They're expecting your announcement. Good, Ethan said. Thank you, Arthur, for everything. Your father would be proud of the man you've become, Ethan. Patient, principled, don't ever lose that. The next evening, Ethan arrived at Le Ciel a few minutes early. He was dressed in a bespoke navy suit, one he had not worn in the 2 years of his self-imposed exile from his own life. The cut was perfect, the fabric exquisite. It was the kind of suit that didn't shout its expense. It whispered it. When he gave his name, the maitre d' didn't check a list. He simply nodded. Of course, Mr. Fairchild Miller, your table is ready. Ethan had booked the restaurant's most coveted table, a secluded corner booth with a panoramic view of the city lights glittering below like a fallen constellation. A bottle of vintage champagne was already chilling in a silver bucket beside the table. Clara and Eleanor arrived together, sweeping in like conquering heroines. They were both dressed to the nines, radiating an aura of triumphant expectation. When Clara saw Ethan, she paused. She took in the suit, the confident way he stood, the sheer opulence of their surroundings. A flicker of something, not suspicion, but a new kind of assessment, crossed her face. This was the version of Ethan she had been trying to create, and here he was, fully formed. She was ecstatic, believing it was her own influence made manifest. Ethan, darling, she breathed, gliding towards him and giving him a kiss that was more performative than passionate. You look incredible. And this place. Good evening, Ethan, Eleanor said, her smile wide and genuine for the first time since she'd met him. This is quite the surprise. Clara, Eleanor, he said, his voice even and welcoming. Please sit. He was the perfect host. He charmed the waiter, ordered for the table with an expertise that surprised them both, and kept their champagne glasses full. For the first hour, the conversation was light. Clara and Eleanor were in their element, talking about society gossip, upcoming charity galas, and their summer plans for the Hamptons. They were giving him a glimpse of the world. He was finally, in their minds, preparing to enter. Ethan listened more than he spoke, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to their effusive excitement. They mistook his silence for awe. As the main courses were cleared away, a quiet settled over the table. The city lights pulsed below them. The moment had arrived. Ethan leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped on the white linen tablecloth. I'm glad we could do this, he began, his voice dropping to a more serious register. There are some things we need to discuss. Clara beamed at him, placing her hand over his. Anything, darling. We're here for you. She thought this was his preamble to a grand apology, perhaps even the presentation of a new ring. I wanted to talk about value, Ethan said, about what makes something or someone valuable. Clara and Eleanor exchanged a brief, confused look. This was not the topic they were expecting. Well, Eleanor began, ever the pragmatist, value is determined by the market. Rarity, demand, craftsmanship, it's quite simple, really. Is it? Ethan asked, his gaze fixed on Clara. I think it's more complicated than that. Some things have a value that can't be quantified, a sentimental value. Clara's smile became fixed. She knew where this was going, but the context was all wrong. Why would he bring up the old ring here, in this temple of wealth and success? Ethan, we've been through this, she said, her tone gentle but firm. I know you're upset about the ring, and I am truly, deeply sorry. That's why we're here, isn't it? To move forward, to bigger and better things. The ring, Ethan said, his voice as soft as silk, was not something to be moved forward from. It was something to be lived up to. He slowly withdrew his hand from under hers. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. He unlocked it and placed it on the table between them. The screen lit up with the social media post from Amelia's party. The photo was bright and cheerful. Amelia's smile, the clinking glasses, and, on her hand, his mother's ring. He didn't say a word. He simply let them look. The silence that fell over the table was heavier than any words could have been. The festive glow of the restaurant, the murmur of other diners, the sparkling city below, it all seemed to fade into a distant hum. All that existed was the illuminated screen on the table. Clara stared at the phone, her face draining of all color. The carefully constructed mask of poise and confidence dissolved, revealing the raw panic beneath. Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. Eleanor, beside her, leaned in closer, her eyes narrowing as she processed the image and the damning caption. Her hand, which had been resting on her wine glass, clenched into a fist. "I don't understand," Clara finally stammered, her voice a thin, reedy whisper. It was a weak, pathetic defense, the last gasp of a cornered liar. "Don't you?" Ethan's voice was still quiet, but it held a new edge, a blade of cold, hard steel. "It seems quite clear. You lied to me. You took an object you knew was the single most meaningful possession I had, an irreplaceable piece of my mother's soul, and you gave it away like a party favor to impress your cousin." Clara flinched as if he had struck her. She looked at her mother, a desperate, silent plea for help, but Eleanor's face was a stony mask of fury. Not at Ethan, but at Clara, for being so careless, so stupidly caught. "It wasn't like that," Clara insisted, her voice gaining a shrill, defensive edge. "I was going to get it back. It was just a loan. Amelia needed something for her engagement photos, something with a story. I was going to tell you." "A loan?" Ethan repeated the word, letting it hang in the air and rot. "You told me you lost it. You performed a tragedy for me in our living room. You cried, and then you offered to buy me a replacement, as if my mother's legacy was a commodity that could be upgraded." He leaned back in his chair, his gaze sweeping from Clara's panicked face to Eleanor's cold one. "For 2 years, I have been an object of your condescension, a project. You judged my car, my clothes, my home, my friends. You saw me as raw material for the life you felt you deserved. Every dinner party, every family gathering was a subtle, or not so subtle, tribunal on my inadequacy." He began to list them, his memory flawless. "At Christmas, Eleanor, you asked me if my firm provided a pension plan, with the clear implication that I would need one. On my birthday, Clara, you gave me a membership to your country club, not as a gift, but as a prescription for my social deficiencies. You've corrected my taste in wine, in art, in literature. You have systematically attempted to erase every part of me that didn't fit your blueprint for a successful husband." Each sentence was delivered with calm, devastating precision. It was not an angry outburst. It was a final report, a clinical summary of their relationship. Clara was now openly crying, but these were not the calculated tears of her earlier performance. These were the hot, messy tears of humiliation and fear. "Ethan, stop! Please, I love you." The words, which should have been a balm, were the greatest insult of all. "No, you don't," Ethan said, his voice devoid of all emotion. "You love the idea of what you could turn me into. You love the potential you thought you saw, but you have never for 1 second seen me, because if you had, you would have known about the ring." He paused, letting his words sink in. "You called it an old-fashioned thing, a placeholder. You dismissed it because it was understated. You, Eleanor, with your supposed eye for value, you saw only a small diamond on a simple band." He leaned forward again, his eyes locking onto Clara's. "That old-fashioned thing was designed by my mother, Catherine Fairchild." The name landed in the opulent room with the force of a physical blow. Fairchild. Even in their insulated world of status and wealth, the name was legendary. Fairchild Consolidated Holdings was a titan of industry, a global empire of construction, development, and architecture. Catherine Fairchild, though she had passed away over a decade ago, was still revered not just as the matriarch of the dynasty, but as a brilliant designer in her own right, whose bespoke jewelry pieces were fought over at auction houses and treasured in private collections. Eleanor's jaw went slack. Her carefully maintained composure shattered into a million pieces. She stared at Ethan as if seeing him for the first time. The simple suit was no longer simple. The quiet confidence was no longer meekness. It was power. The ring, Ethan continued, his voice as soft as a death sentence, is the étoile du matin, the morning star. It was the first piece she ever designed for my father. The diamond is a flawless, internally perfect stone from a long-closed African mine. There are only 3 like it in the world. It was featured in a retrospective of her work at the Met last year. Its estimated value at auction is somewhere north of $3 million. He let that number settle. $3 million. Clara's face was a grotesque mask of horror, greed, and despair. She looked at her own hands, then back at the phone, as if she could will the ring to reappear on her finger. But its monetary value, as you can imagine, is the least important thing about it, Ethan said. You gave away my mother. You took her love and her legacy, and you traded it for a moment of social cachet at a party. He finally looked away from them, out at the city lights, and in doing so, you told me everything I ever need to know about you. The aftermath of the revelation was a deafening silence. Clara and Eleanor sat frozen, their minds reeling, trying to recalibrate a reality that had just been shattered. The man they had pitied, patronized, and planned to elevate was, in fact, so far above them he was in a different stratosphere entirely. He wasn't climbing their social ladder, he owned the building it was leaning against. Clara was the first to break, her mind scrambling to find a foothold in the new, terrifying landscape. The tears of humiliation transformed into tears of desperate appeal. Ethan, I didn't know, she stammered, reaching across the table for his hand, which he did not offer. If I had known, my God, Ethan, I am so sorry. It was a mistake. A stupid, terrible mistake. I can fix it. I'll call Amelia right now. I'll get it back. Oh, I have no doubt you'll get it back, Ethan said, his voice cold and dismissive. A $3 million ring has a way of finding its way home. In fact, I've already taken the liberty of speaking with Amelia and her fiancé myself. Clara recoiled. You called them? I did, Ethan confirmed. I explained the situation. The ring's provenance, its value, and the misunderstanding under which it was given to her. Amelia was, as you can imagine, horrified, not just at the value, but at the deception. The ring is being sent by a secured courier to my lawyer's office in the morning. Her fiancé, a respectable young man from a family that values integrity, was appalled that she was put in such a position. I believe their engagement is now on rather shaky ground. Clara looked as if she'd been slapped. She had not only lost the ring and her fiancé, but she had also torched her relationship with her cousin and damaged her own standing within her family. Ethan then turned his attention to Eleanor, whose face had settled into a pale, tight mask of damage control. And you, Eleanor, he said, his voice losing its last shred of warmth, you are the silent enabler. You fostered her greed, her superficiality. You encouraged her to see me as a project, a stepping stone. You judged me with every breath and found me wanting. You, who pride yourself on your knowledge of value, you saw a masterpiece and declared it a trinket because it didn't glitter enough for your tastes. Eleanor straightened her back, attempting to muster some semblance of her former authority. Now, Ethan, let's not be hasty. This is a shock to us all. We've all made mistakes. This wasn't a mistake, Ethan cut her off, his voice sharp and final. It was a character assessment, and you both failed. He placed his napkin on the table. The meal was over. Our engagement, Clara, is, of course, terminated. The apartment you were so keen on, the penthouse in the Westlake development, I bought it this afternoon. I'll be moving in tomorrow. You will have 24 hours to remove your belongings from the apartment we shared. After that, the locks will be changed. The cruelty of it was poetic. The very home she had coveted, the one she had pushed him to secure as a symbol of their future success, was now his alone. A fortress he was sealing against her. As for the money you were so eager to pool, he continued, delivering the final blow, the joint savings account we opened was a test. It contained a small fraction of my personal discretionary funds. I wanted to see if you would contribute, or if you would only see it as a resource to be drawn from. In 6 months, you have made 0 deposits and have used the debit card for over $15,000 in personal expenses, hair appointments, designer shoes, lunches with friends. As of an hour ago, that account has been frozen and its remaining balance transferred. You will find your credit card, the one linked to that account, will be declined. Clara stared at him, her mouth agape. The entire scaffolding of her life, her fiancé, her social standing, her access to funds, her future home, had been dismantled in the space of 10 minutes. She was left with nothing but the rubble of her own arrogance. "Ethan, please," she begged, her voice cracking. "Don't do this. We can fix this. I can change. I know I can." Ethan looked at her, and for the first time he felt a sliver of something akin to pity, not for her situation, but for the hollowness within her that had led her here. "No, Clara, you can't," he said, the truth in his words both gentle and absolute. "You can't change because you don't see that there's anything wrong with who you are. You're not sorry for what you did. You're sorry you got caught. You're sorry you misjudged my wallet. You are not sorry you broke my heart, because you were never in a position to do so." He stood up, tall and resolute in his perfectly tailored suit. He looked down at the two women, their faces a mess of shock and despair. They looked small, diminished, stripped of the arrogant confidence they had worn like armor. "Thank you for dinner," he said, the formal words a final, cutting dismissal. It was very illuminating. He turned and walked away without a backward glance, leaving them alone at the table with the $1,000,000 view, the half-empty bottle of champagne, and the ruin of their own making. The maitre d' rushed forward to intercept him, but Ethan simply shook his head. "The bill has been taken care of," he said, and continued toward the exit, stepping out of the gilded cage and into the cool, clean air of his new life. The days that followed were a blur of calculated, decisive action for Ethan, and a slow, agonizing implosion for Clara. True to his word, Ethan had the locks on his old apartment changed exactly 24 hours after the dinner. Clara, having spent the night at her mother's house in a state of shock, had sent a moving crew to retrieve her things. The crew was met by a security guard Ethan had hired, who supervised the removal of every last designer shoe and silk blouse. Clara was not permitted on the premises. She was, in every sense of the word, locked out of the life she had tried to commandeer. Her world unraveled with shocking speed. The news of Ethan's true identity spread through her social circle like wildfire, but the narrative was not the one she would have hoped for. It wasn't the story of the one that got away. It was the story of the girl who fumbled a dynasty over a lie. Amelia, furious and humiliated, had made sure their mutual friends knew the exact details of the ring incident. Clara was no longer seen as an aspirational figure. She was a cautionary tale, a subject of gossip and pity. The invitations to galas and parties dried up. The friends who had once flocked to her side now avoided her calls. Her social currency, built on a foundation of future promise, was now worthless. The financial consequences were just as severe. The declined credit card was only the beginning. She discovered that the lease on her luxury car, which she had assumed was a minor monthly expense, was suddenly an insurmountable burden, without the supplementary income from Ethan's test account. The life she had curated on her own modest salary was a house of cards, and Ethan had just removed the bottom card. She tried to reach him, of course. She sent a barrage of texts, alternating between tearful apologies, furious accusations, and desperate pleas for a second chance. They all went unanswered, delivered into a digital void. She went to his old apartment building, but the doorman, under new instructions, politely informed her that she was not welcome. She even tried to go to the offices of Sterling Cole, only to be told by a confused receptionist that no Ethan Miller worked there anymore. He had vanished, absorbed back into a world she couldn't touch. Meanwhile, Ethan moved into the penthouse at Westlake. It was a vast, minimalist space of glass and white marble, with views that stretched to the horizon. It was the kind of home Clara had dreamed of, but for Ethan, it was simply a place to live. He left most of it empty, bringing over only the few pieces that mattered: his father's armchair, which he placed by the vast window, his grandfather's books, which he arranged on a simple shelf, and his mother's painting, which he hung in the entryway, the first thing he saw when he came home. A week after the dinner, a small, heavily insured package arrived at the office of Arthur Davies. Arthur brought it to the penthouse himself. He found Ethan standing by the window, looking out at the city. "It's here," Arthur said, holding out the package. Ethan took it. His hands were steady. He unwrapped the layers of protective packaging until he was left with the familiar dark blue velvet box. He opened it. The ring sat nestled in its hollow, the single diamond catching the afternoon light, sending a spray of rainbows across the white marble floor. It looked no different than it had in his dresser drawer, yet everything had changed. He picked it up, its weight familiar in his palm. He had gotten it back, but the victory felt quiet, somber. "You did the right thing, Ethan," Arthur said gently, sensing his mood. "Did I?" Ethan asked, his gaze distant. "It felt necessary. But I take no joy in her destruction." "This wasn't your destruction to cause," Arthur corrected him. "It was hers. You simply provided the mirror. She did the rest." Some people, when shown their own reflection, choose to change. Others choose to break the mirror. And some, like Clara, are simply shattered by the image. Arthur placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "The board is meeting tomorrow. They are unanimously in favor of appointing you as the new CEO. Your father's vision, your mother's integrity, your own patience. You are ready. This whole ordeal, as painful as it was, has proven that." Ethan looked from the ring in his hand to his reflection in the vast window. He saw his own face, and behind it, the sprawling city his family had helped to build. For 2 years, he had lived a small life to learn a big lesson. He had wanted to understand the world from the ground up, to earn his place, rather than inherit it. In the process, he had learned something far more valuable about human nature, about the vast difference between price and worth. He closed his hand around the ring. "All right, Arthur," he said, his voice firm with a newfound resolve. "Let's get to work." Months later, the city looked different from the CEO's office on the 81st floor of the Fairchild Tower. The view was even more expansive than from his penthouse, a god's-eye perspective of the metropolis. The office was large, but Ethan had kept it sparse. The walls were adorned, not with awards or photos of him shaking hands with powerful people, but with architectural renderings of his company's most innovative projects: a sustainable housing initiative, a new public arts center, a hospital wing designed for pediatric care. Ethan Fairchild Miller was no longer an experiment. He was a reality. The transition had been seamless. The quiet, observant junior architect had become a quiet, observant chief executive. He didn't rule by decree or intimidation. He led by example, with a deep, nuanced understanding of the business that surprised the veteran board members. He had his father's strategic mind and his mother's eye for detail and integrity. He was, as Arthur Davies had said, ready. He rarely thought of Clara. When he did, it wasn't with anger or resentment, but with a distant clinical pity. He had heard through the grapevine that she had been forced to sell her car, give up her apartment, and move back in with her mother. Her social life had evaporated, and her career, which had always been secondary to her marital ambitions, had stalled. She was a ghost, haunting the life she thought she was owed. He hoped, for her own sake, that she would one day find a way to build a life based on something real, something within herself, but he knew it was not his concern. His lesson was complete. Now she had to learn her own. One afternoon, while reviewing a proposal for a new foundation dedicated to sponsoring young designers and architects, he found himself unconsciously twisting a ring on his finger. It wasn't his mother's ring. That was safe, locked away. This was his father's signet ring, a simple gold band bearing the Fairchild crest, which he now wore on his right hand, a symbol of his responsibility. His thoughts drifted back to his mother's ring. He had gotten it back, but he knew he could never give it to someone else. Its story was now too complicated, too freighted with the memory of betrayal. It was no longer just a symbol of his parents' perfect love. It was now also a symbol of his own painful, necessary education. He opened his desk drawer and took out the small, leather-bound journal. He flipped through the pages, past the intricate sketches of necklaces and bracelets, until he found the page dedicated to the Étoile du Matin. There was the original sketch, a delicate drawing in graphite, and beneath it, his mother's elegant script. Value, she had written, is a measure of love, not the love others have for an object, but the love that went into its creation. A thing made with integrity, with purpose, with a quiet heart, will always be worth more than a thing made for applause. The applause will fade, but the integrity remains. Ethan closed the journal. He finally understood. Clara's mistake wasn't simply that she didn't recognize the ring's monetary value. Her fatal flaw was that she was incapable of recognizing integrity itself. She lived in a world of applause, and now the applause had stopped. Ethan stood and walked to the window, looking down at the city pulsing with life below. He had his family's fortune, his father's company, his mother's legacy. But what he truly valued, what this whole painful journey had given him, was a clear understanding of his own principles. He would build things, buildings, companies, relationships, not for applause, but with a quiet heart. He would build them with integrity. That was the true inheritance his mother had left him, a legacy far more valuable than a diamond in a velvet box. The story of Ethan and Clara is a powerful reminder that true worth is not about what you have, but who you are. It's about integrity, patience, and the quiet strength to stay true to yourself, even when others try to mold you into their own image. What do you think is the most important lesson from this story? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Your insights are what make this community so special, and if you found this story of vindication and wisdom satisfying, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more tales of justice and redemption. Thank you for being here today, and we'll see you in the next story.